So it's good to be back for a second hit at Isaiah this morning. As I walked out of the door this morning to catch the bus, I went to do up the top button on my shirt and found it's missing. I need to say that because Mum and my old aunts are here, and they're sure to say, "David, you should have done up your top button. You were looking very scruffy." So, sorry about that. But actually, it's appropriate because I'm going to be imagining my time living in Malaysia. Aha. Now, does this go? Do we have a flat battery here, Don, or does this need to be activated? In 2012, aha, thank you, great. In 2012, I lived for 7 months in Kuala Lumpur, the capital of Malaysia. I was always hot there, so where possible, of course, I left my button undone, so it sort of fits the feeling, and this is a shirt from that part of the world. It's a great country, Malaysia. There are 3 main races: Malay, Chinese, and Indian. That makes it interesting, especially if you like food. You can have Indian curry for breakfast, Chinese noodles for lunch, Malay nasi goreng for dinner. It's great. And I loved the different festivals. The Muslim month of Ramadan, the food markets, Ramadan, Eva's missing them, right? I often ask Malaysians when I meet them, because I lived there, what do you most miss about home? I think every single time it is food, that's right. One person once, I think, said family, but really, food's all that matters, yes. Then there's Indian Diwali, the festival of lights, Chinese New Year. But the festival that especially struck me was 31st of August. How many Malaysians do we have here? Quite a few. Very good. Yes, 31st of August, that was Malaysia's 55th Independence Day in 2012, 55 years since the country was born. So I got up early that day, I went to Dataran Merdeka, the central square, and I never saw so many flags in my life. People kept giving me flags to wave. I've got one here. It used to have a stick on it. Now I use it to keep the dust off my keyboard in my room. And I gave the other ones away to friends with kids. Maybe we should try and drape it up here in honour of the Malaysian members. And indeed I brought a clip. So I should have thought of this in advance. Maybe like that, huh? How about that? And I'd never seen such a big parade. Soldiers and tanks rolled through. Police, firefighters, ambulance staff, CEOs of big companies celebrating business success, AirAsia air hostesses, they just kept coming, children singing and dancing. Overhead, the Air Force jets flew by. It was amazing. In New Zealand, we don't have this sort of National Day event, so I found it a very new and striking experience. Some of the formal troops going by, the children dancing, patriotic Malaysians dressed in the flag. Did any of you guys here do that? Yes. That night I went to a huge sports stadium and it was full of people singing national songs, waving the flag. And what struck me was it felt like a mega church service. The songs sounded like worship songs. The speeches sounded like sermons. The video clips, the images, the slogans reminded me of the Bible, especially the motto that year, promise, fulfilled. And I thought, what's going on here? This is a secular or Muslim majority country, so why does this event feel so religious, even Christian? And then I realised there are two big biblical themes here. The first is Exodus. 3,500 years ago or so, the people of Israel were slaves in Egypt. Most of us know the story. They had to work hard making bricks to build the Egyptian empire. They were beaten if they didn't work. God sent Moses to lead them out of Egypt, to set them free. We know the story. And when they walked through the Dead Sea, that was like the birth of Israel. That was their Independence Day. As I've lived in Asia, I've become aware that for many countries in Asia, Africa, South America, with this story, because they, sometimes for centuries, experienced being forced to work to make foreign empires rich. They felt themselves crushed by mostly Western powers. Later, centuries later, this people of Israel became slaves in Babylon. We saw that last week. We saw how God set them free. Let's look at this, read this promise together now. Shall we read this together? Galilee of the Gentiles, between the Jordan and the sea, will be filled with glory. For those who live in a land of deep darkness, a light will shine. For you will break the yoke of their slavery and lift the heavy burden from their shoulders. You will break the oppressor's rod. Free the captives from prison. Release those who sit in dark dungeons. Isaiah was promising a new exodus, a new freedom. Last week we saw how he freed the people from Babylon and led them home. And as I've said, for many countries in the world, these stories from the Bible are not just back then, but actually a part of their recent history. Every year Jews remember the exodus from Egypt, how God set them free. And that's what was happening as people waved those flags. They were remembering their own exodus. 31st of August 1957, when the British flag came down, the Malay flag flew high, and the Prime Minister of Malaysia shouted 7 times, "Freedom!" It's all about the flags and the parades. That was about an exodus. Here's the second thing that reminded me of the Bible. All the videos, the YouTube clips and so on at Independence, they showed old aunties and uncles sitting together in old-time cafes, drinking Titheridge, happily chatting, or school children happily playing together, most often 3 children, like on the right, Chinese, Indian, Malay, the 3 different races happily united together as one Malaysia, the government slogan. A beautiful picture of unity, old people together, young people together, all races and religions as one. Isaiah also dreamt of a society like that, sometimes called the Peaceful Kingdom. Let's read this together now. I will create Jerusalem as a place of happiness. The sound of weeping and will be heard in it no more. 100 years old and you're still middle-aged. Wow. And then in that day, the wolf and the lamb will live together. The lion will eat hay like a cow. And then the Lord will mediate between nations. So we have a world without tears, where no one dies young anymore. Babies can play with wild animals like snakes because there's no violence or danger or evil anymore. Weapons are recycled into tools for the farm because no one goes to war anymore. The peaceful kingdom, all peoples in harmony. The image of one Malaysia, and I even got the fridge magnet. One Malaysia, and maybe, will that stick here too? Yes, the Malaysians will be happy. And the little state goodie bag. It's a beautiful picture, these verses from Isaiah. The United Nations picks this up. Their goal is to unite nations, settle disputes, and stop war. Outside the United Nations headquarters in New York is the Isaiah wall with that last verse we just read. Across the road, I think, is a park with a statue of a man beating a sword into a plough to work the ground on a farm. It's a beautiful vision, and I think we all long for a world like that, a world free of violence and war. I think we all deeply want a world like that. We want Isaiah's vision. We're waiting for Exodus freedom, longing for the peaceful kingdom. And that's why I felt moved, I think, at the independence celebrations, and that's why I saw some people with a tear in their eyes as they waved those flags. Well, in 2015, I went to Singapore for SG50, Singapore's 50th birthday since 9th of August, 1965. Any Singaporeans here? One only? Yeah. Oh, you lived there? Yes, okay, yes. So I found some community celebrations and took part. Sorry, wrong way. And took part. This was a big housing lot group, so there were squares, I think, of white and red, and from above, I think, it made up a big SG50. So there's an honorary Singaporean, and they gave me the cap. I didn't have a red shirt, so I wore a white one to fit in. And I watched the parade on the big screen. Once again, I was moved by the images of social harmony. Children and grandmas, CEOs and taxi drivers, locked into a gospel. Taxi drivers, not maybe tax collectors too, I don't know. All sorts of people, all professions, Chinese, Indian, Malay again, happily laughing together, hugging each other, playing sport together, enjoying the community together. Again, that lovely picture of heaven, the peaceable kingdom of Isaiah. That night I walked home thinking, wow, this is such a blessed country. It's like heaven. Then I saw some poor guys sleeping in the gutter, not often in Singapore, and I realised, well, it's not quite heaven yet. At first, when I saw those videos, I almost had a tear of joy in my eye. It's so beautiful. But then, when I realised it's not true, there's a tear of sorrow too. The vision is beautiful, but we're not there yet. In Malaysia, many old people have told me, when I grew up as a kid, at Christmas, we all went and ate together at our Christian neighbours. At the end of Ramadan, we all feasted together with our Muslim friends. At Chinese New Year, we all came together and had fun with the crackers and fireworks and things. Race, religion, it didn't matter. We all hung out as one. But now they say that doesn't happen. One Malaysia, say the signs, but the country is divided. Promise fulfilled, say the banners, and that made quite a few people mad or sad because they felt that really the promise of independence had not been fulfilled. What they had hoped for their nation had not come. Where was the Exodus freedom that looked so bright in 1957? What happened to the peaceful kingdom? So are the songs and slogans and videos of independence just propaganda? Is it just the government playing with our hearts so we'll vote for them next time? Some people think so. Should we throw out the visions of Isaiah because they're just lies? Or should we have another look? We saw Isaiah's promises of light in the darkness, freedom from war. The boots of the soldiers are burnt. A beautiful vision, but when will it come? In the next verses we find, it's when a new king is born. Let's read these verses together. For a child is born to us. His prince will never end. Who was the greatest king in Israel's history? King David, that's right. He set Israel free. He defeated their enemies so they had peace and safety. He built Jerusalem into a great city. He wrote the Psalms to worship God. A strong and smart and godly king. He became a symbol of the perfect king. Now Isaiah says a descendant of David will come, but someone greater than David. His rule of justice and fairness will last forever. He's the everlasting Prince of Peace. The dream of Exodus freedom depends on the slave-freeing king. And remember the baby playing in the zoo? When will that time come? How will such peace and safety arrive? Look at the verses just before. Let's read these. Out of the stump of David's valley will grow a shoot. So again, a descendant of David, a great king, greater than David, full of God's spirit and wisdom and strength. He is the one who brings peace to the zoo, who makes the lions as gentle as lambs. The hope of the peaceful kingdom rests on the peacemaking king. And that verse of freedom in chapter 42, free the captives from prison, release those who are in dungeons. Just before, God speaks about a servant who sounds the same as the David-like king. Let's read this. Look at my servant. I love that last verse. Imagine a candle flame. At first it's bright maybe, but then it slowly gets weaker. It's flickering. It's nearly going out, just a dull glow. But he doesn't put it out. He shelters it with his hand from the wind. He blows his spirit into it, blows his breath on it, until it starts to burn brightly again. That's a lovely picture. Last week in chapter 40, we saw how God began by promising comfort to Jerusalem. He spoke tenderly, gently to them. Here is a servant king with the same spirit. He is strong to bring justice in the world. He is gentle and cares for the weak. He breaks the slave master's rod. He bandages broken hearts. Let's see what he says here. Let's read these words. The Spirit of the Sovereign Lord is upon me. So what do we see from all these verses in Isaiah? The promises all depend on a leader with the wisdom and strength and justice of God. The Spirit-filled, slave-freeing, peacemaking King. So where can we find such a hero to lead us? Well, at their independence celebrations, many countries remember their first great leaders, figures like King David, who built the nation up. And getting back to there, I forgot my Singapore flags. You can tell I had a late night last night. I'm dropping a few balls. So here's the Singapore flag for our Singaporean friends. Here's the little, who knows this chap? Singaporeans? Oh, there's only one singer. One of the Singaporean mascots, and the goodie bag, a little more generous from Singapore, actually, the government there. Singapore Advance, our nation, our home, SG50. So in Singapore, I was also there a few months before SG50 in March, when Lee Kuan Yew died. It was remarkable to be there. He was an amazing man. He built Singapore from a small village to a great world city where you can walk anywhere safely at night. That is an achievement. I was amazed to see how the people loved and admired him. All across the city there were thousands of flowers and cards and posters that people brought. This is from a kindergarten. All the children have made little messages of love to Mr. Lee, who many of their parents had met. Lee Kuan Yew did amazing things. But as we know, Singapore is not perfect. He did not quite reach the peaceable, peaceful kingdom. So, maybe the United Nations can help. Indeed, they have that vision of Isaiah, beating swords into plowshares, making peace between nations, stopping conflicts. Well, when there is a conflict, typically they send peacekeeping troops. Now, maybe I'm cynical, but sometimes it seems like they send well-equipped soldiers with big guns to stop poorer people with smaller guns from fighting. It almost seems a bit like when I was a kid. Now, maybe I wanted to beat up my sister, my little sister, right, smaller than me. But if my dad was there, he's bigger than me, so I didn't. Kind of makes peace, but a peace that's forced from the outside. True peace can only come when there is justice and fairness in the world, and when there's a power that can change our hearts inside. True peace can only come when a leader, a king like Isaiah comes, one who brings fairness, especially for the poor, one who has God's Spirit and can give God's Spirit to work in our hearts and free us from evil. Lee Kuan Yew or the UN or even my dad, they can't do that, but only the promised King. So who is this Spirit-filled, slave-freeing, peacemaking King? Where can we find him? Isaiah chapter 4, remember, began with a voice calling in the desert. We saw this last week. Prepare the way of the Lord. And we saw that in all 4 Gospels, the books about Jesus in the Bible. At the start, John the Baptist comes in the desert and says these same words. What happens after that? Jesus comes to John. He is baptized in the river Jordan. And then, let's read this. After his baptism, as Jesus came up out of the water, in 3 key visions of Isaiah that we saw, the sign of the promised King is God's Spirit on him. All 4 Gospels start with that. Does that maybe mean that Jesus is the slave-freeing, peacemaking King? Then Jesus goes to the desert, he wrestles with the devil, he comes back to Galilee, and look at what Matthew writes then. This fulfilled what God said through the prophet Isaiah. I imagine this as like a public lecture where there's a guest speaker. The host introduces the main speaker before they come on. So Matthew introduces Jesus. Matthew says, remember those promises, light in the dark, Exodus, freedom, the end of war, the peaceable kingdom. That's all the stuff that this guy's about, so listen to him as he speaks. Our last gospel stop is in Luke. And here, before Jesus starts his public life, or right at the start, he goes to the synagogue. He stands up and, let's read this, the scroll of Isaiah the prophet was handed to him. So this is like Jesus' mission statement, his life purpose. That's what he came to do. And once again, it's all about Exodus freedom, bringing the peaceful kingdom. All the promises of Isaiah, all the hopes of the heart come down to Jesus. God's Spirit-filled, slave-freeing, peacemaking King. Now, last week we saw the people of Israel were slaves in Babylon, locked in the darkness, too scared to hope. But God said, or Isaiah said, God can make a way where there is no way. God led them out of Babylon. He broke their chains. Exodus, freedom. God brought them home to Jerusalem, to justice and joy, home to where they belonged, home to the peaceful kingdom. That's the good news of Isaiah, the gospel of Isaiah, and it's the good news of Jesus Christ. Wherever we are, whatever our chains, he can set us free and bring us home to the peaceful kingdom. He came to tell those who mourn, the broken-hearted, the poor, the slaves, God wants to set you free and bring you home. He came to tell them that the time, the year of God's favour has come. SG50 was a Jubilee year. Jubilee means Golden Jubilee, the 50th birthday. Who knows where the word Jubilee comes from? Long ago, before Isaiah even, Moses gave an instruction about a special year every 50 years. Moses said, in that 50th year, blow the ram's horn loud and long. Set this year apart as holy, a time to proclaim freedom throughout the land. This 50th year will be a jubilee, a year of jubilation, great celebration. In that year, if you had got so poor you'd had to sell your home, it came back to the original owners. Your home was restored. If life had got so hard you'd lost your freedom and became a slave, in that year you were free. The Jubilee year, slaves are set free to come home. And that is what Jesus came to promise. An exodus freedom from sin and death. A peaceful kingdom where we belong, of love without war. At SG50, I read, 51,000 Christians gathered in the Singapore Sports Hub, the biggest prayer meeting in Singapore's history, to ask that God would make this not just a political jubilee, but a true spiritual jubilee for their nation, when God would truly bring the peaceful kingdom to the nation of Singapore. I think we all have things that make us slaves, sometimes things outside and always things inside. Jesus wants to set us free. What's your Exodus story? In a few minutes, you can share it. And we've all had broken relationships or been broken by life. Jesus wants to bring us healing and peace. Where's your peaceable, peaceful kingdom, where you find healing and reconciliation and rest? We all long for freedom and peace, and that's why those independence celebrations touched my heart and why people waved flags with a tear. We've all been disappointed by dreams that fail and leaders that fall, promises not fulfilled. But there is one to whom all the prophecies point, in whom all promises are fulfilled. God's Spirit-filled, slave-freeing, peacemaking, promised King. And now, as usual, we'll have about 20 minutes for questions. We have many different countries here. Kiwis are boring for this first question because we don't really, but most other countries, I think, will share a little of your experiences of Independence Day, freedom in the story of freedom in your country, perhaps? And what's the best example you can think of a dream, peaceful society? Singapore is certainly a good option, perhaps. We've seen a lot of verses from Isaiah. Maybe one or two of those touched your heart. You don't have time to look at all of them, but maybe check out one or two with your group that meant a lot. Is there something new you learnt about Jesus? How can we experience his freedom and peace? And some of you will have your own Exodus story of how Jesus set you free. Some of you will have found a peaceful kingdom, a sense of rest and reconciliation, and a family that reflects the visions we've seen. So I guess about 20 minutes for discussion as usual.